Don't belong in this room. He said it loud enough for the whole floor to hear. 32 people in the conference room of Hargrove and Aldrich Financial Partners, and every single one of them went quiet. Elliot Hargrove didn't look up from his phone when he said it. That was the part that stung the most. Not even the words themselves, but the fact that he couldn't be bothered to make eye contact when he delivered them. Like she was furniture. Like she was something you noticed only when it was in the way. Pioneer stood at the doorway with a manila folder pressed against her chest and said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that silence was sometimes the smartest thing you could carry into a room. She had taken the train from East Flatbush that morning, the 40:15, because the 45 always ran late and she couldn't afford to be late. Not today. She'd ironed her blazer the night before, the navy one she bought at the Goodwill on Fulton Street 3 years ago, the one with the small burn mark on the right lapel that she always kept facing the wall. She'd covered it with a small pin, a gold lotus, her mother's, and told herself no one would notice. She had the folder with her. Inside it was a 60-page analysis she'd built from scratch, over 11 days, working from her kitchen table after her son Benji went to sleep. Benji was 6. He still needed the hall light on. She'd learned to work in half-light. The analysis was about Hargrove and Aldrich's third-quarter restructuring plan. Specifically, the part of it that was going to cost them somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 million if no one caught the error buried in the interest rate projections on page 41. Priya had caught it. She wasn't even supposed to have access to the document. She was a file processing associate, level 2, which meant she organized intake folders, updated client databases, and occasionally was trusted with the copy machine. Her manager, a thin man named Douglas Platt, who wore the same 3 ties on rotation, had accidentally included her in a mass email 2 weeks ago. An oversight. A company-wide internal brief about the restructuring intended only for directors and above. Douglas had sent a follow-up email 20 minutes later. Please disregard if this does not pertain to your role. Priya had not disregarded it. She'd read it 3 times. Then she'd pulled up every associated financial document she could find in the shared drive, the ones she technically had access to, the ones anyone at the company could reach if they knew where to look, which most people didn't. She'd spent 11 nights cross-referencing interest rate assumptions against the Federal Reserve's published guidance, running the numbers herself on a spreadsheet she built in Google Sheets because she didn't have Excel at home. She found the error on the 9th night. It wasn't dramatic the moment she found it. She just sat there in the kitchen, the hall light throwing a thin yellow stripe across the linoleum floor, and stared at the numbers. Then she checked them again. Then she made herself a cup of tea and checked them a 3rd time. The projection on page 41 assumed a fixed-rate environment through Q2 of the following year. But the Fed had signaled, clearly, publicly, in language that wasn't subtle, a likely adjustment in March. Nobody at Hargrove and Aldrich had accounted for it. The model was built on a floor that wasn't there. She printed 60 pages at the Staples 2 blocks from her apartment. Cost her $8.40, which she had, but only barely. She put the pages in the manila folder. She wrote a 1-page cover memo in plain language, no jargon, just the problem and the fix. And then she requested a meeting with Elliot Hargrove. His assistant had called her back the same afternoon, which surprised her. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday 9 a.m., the 32nd floor. She ironed the blazer that night. You don't belong in this room. Elliot Hargrove finally looked up from his phone. He was 51, silver-haired in the way that men who've always had money tend to go silver, like it was planned, like even the aging was elegant. He had the kind of face that expected agreement. Miss, he looked at the notepad in front of him, near. Yes, she said. You're in file processing. I am. Level 2. Yes. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. So someone explained to me how a level 2 file associate ended up in my Thursday briefing. From the far end of the table, a man named Bennett Forsyth, Senior Director of Strategy, the man who had built the restructuring model, leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. He was looking at Priya the way you look at something that doesn't make sense to you, not with hostility, not yet, just incomprehension, but she was a word in a foreign language he couldn't quite place. She requested the meeting, the assistant said from near the door. I see that, Elliot said. What I'm asking is why we honored it. Priya took 3 steps into the room. She set the folder on the edge of the conference table, not in front of Elliot, not in front of anyone in particular, just on the table. "Because I found a problem in the Q3 model," she said, "and I thought you'd want to know about it before the restructuring closes." Bennett Forsythe uncrossed his arms. "There's no problem in the Q3 model," he said. "We've had 3 teams review it." "I know," Priya said. "The problem is on page 41. Silence. Elliot looked at Bennett. Bennett looked at the folder. Neither of them moved to open it. "Miss Nair." Elliot's voice was careful now, measured, the way someone speaks when they're deciding how much patience to extend. "I appreciate that you took the time, but this model was built by people with MBAs from Wharton and Columbia. It was reviewed by our risk team, our compliance team, and an outside consulting firm. I'm not sure what you think you found, but the interest rate projection assumes a fixed rate environment through Q2, Priya said. But the Fed signaled an adjustment in March. Your model doesn't account for it. The variance is somewhere between 3.8 and 4.2 million, depending on how the timing shakes out." The room was very quiet. Bennett Forsythe reached forward and pulled the folder toward him. For a moment, no one spoke. Someone near the window shifted in their chair. Someone else cleared their throat. Elliot Hargrove was still looking at Priya, but his expression had changed in some way that was hard to name. Not respect, not yet. Something closer to recalibration. Bennett opened the folder to page 41. He looked at it for a long time. "Where did you get these figures?" he asked, without looking up. "I built the model myself," Priya said. "At home. The source data is all cited on page 57. Bennett turned to page 57. His jaw was tight. "You built a..." He stopped. Started again. "You built a financial model at home." "On Google Sheets," she said. "I know it's not." "Why?" Elliot asked. The question landed oddly, not hostile, genuinely asking. Priya looked at him. "Because I saw the problem and I thought it mattered." She hadn't always been a level 2 file processing associate. Before Benji, before the divorce, before she'd spent 6 months sleeping on her cousin Anita's couch in Crown Heights while she figured out how to start over, Priya had been 3 semesters into a master's program in financial mathematics at NYU, full scholarship. She'd been the only person in her cohort who'd come up entirely through public school. PS 138 in Brooklyn, then James Madison High, then a full ride to CUNY, where she graduated first in her class with a double major in math and economics. She'd deferred her master's enrollment once, when her mother got sick. Then again, when Benji came early and the hospital bills started arriving. By the time she was back on solid ground, if you could call it that, her scholarship had lapsed and the tuition was $52,000 a year. She'd taken the job at Hargrove and Aldrich because it had benefits and a transit card, and because the woman at the temp agency had told her it might lead somewhere. That had been 4 years ago. She didn't tell people about NYU anymore. It had stopped feeling relevant, or maybe it had stopped feeling safe, like something they'd take from her. She said it out loud. She'd told Douglas Platt once, in her first month, when he'd asked about her background. He'd nodded and said, "Well, we all have plans that don't work out," and then assigned her a stack of intake folders to organize by date. She'd organized them. She'd done everything they asked, and she'd done it well, and she'd stayed quiet, and she'd taken the 4:15 train home to Benji, and the hall light and the kitchen table, and she'd kept working. Not for them. For herself, because the work itself, the numbers, the patterns, the logic of it, was the one thing that had never made her feel like she didn't belong somewhere. Bennett Forsythe spent 40 minutes going through the folder while Elliot Hargrove sat at the head of the table and watched. The rest of the room had quietly cleared. People had drifted out one by one, for coffee, for calls, for somewhere else to be. Priya had stayed. Nobody had asked her to leave, and nobody had asked her to sit down. So she stood near the edge of the table and waited. Bennett closed the folder on page 60. He looked at Elliot. "She's right," he said. The words sat in the air between them for a moment before they landed. "She's right," Bennett said again, quieter this time, like he was saying it to himself as much as to the room. "The Fed guidance, I missed it. We all missed it." Elliot was very still. "How much exposure?" he asked. if the restructuring closes as projected, and the rate adjusts in March. Bennett pressed his lips together. 4.1. Maybe 4.3. Elliot turned to look at Priya. This time it was a different kind of look. Not warm, not apologetic. He wasn't that kind of man. But it was direct. He was actually seeing her now in a way he hadn't 15 minutes ago, and they both knew it. "Where are you from?" he asked. She thought about the question for a second. "Brooklyn," she said. "No, I mean your background, your education." "Tierney," she said. "Math and economics. I was enrolled in the financial mathematics program at NYU before I had to step away." Something moved across Elliot's face. "Before you had to step away," he repeated slowly. "Yes. And now you're in file processing." "Level 2, she said. "Yes." He picked up her cover memo, the one-page summary she'd written in plain language, and read it again. She watched him read it. She watched him reach the last line, the one that said, "I am available to walk through any portion of the analysis at your convenience," and she watched something in him make a decision. He set the memo down. "Forsyth," he said, "get legal and risk on the phone. We need to halt the closing until this is reviewed." He stood up and picked up his phone, and was already dialing when he paused at the door and looked back at Priya. "You said you're level 2? "Yes." "Not anymore," he said, and walked out. It was not a fairy tale ending. Real life doesn't work like that. There were 6 weeks of review. There were meetings Priya wasn't invited to, decisions made in rooms she still didn't have access to, conversations that happened above her pay grade in both the literal and figurative sense. The restructuring was delayed. The error was corrected. The exposure was reduced to something manageable. In Priya, she was promoted to senior financial analyst, a title that came with a salary that meant she could finally stop doing math about the grocery bill. She was assigned to Bennett Forsyth's team, which was awkward for exactly 3 weeks before Bennett, to his credit, walked into her office and said, "I want you to know that what you did took guts, and I'm glad you did it," and shook her hand. Douglas Platt sent her a 2-sentence congratulatory email and signed it with his name in 3 rotating ties. Benji asked why she was crying when she got home that Thursday night. She told him she wasn't crying. She had something in her eye, which he accepted because he was 6 and still believed most things she told him. She sat at the kitchen table that night, the same table, the same half-light from the hall, and opened her laptop. Not to work, just to look at something she hadn't looked at in a long time, the NYU Financial Mathematics program page, the requirements, the application window. She closed the laptop after a while and made herself a cup of tea and sat with it in the quiet. She wasn't thinking about the promotion or Bennett Forsyth's handshake or Elliot Hargrove's face when he realized what she'd found. She was thinking about page 41, about the numbers she'd seen that night 9 days into the 11, sitting in the half-dark with the spreadsheet open and the quiet all around her, and the way it had felt. Not triumphant, not angry, just clear. The way it felt when a thing that is wrong becomes, finally, correctable. That feeling had never needed anyone's permission to exist. It had been there in her all along, underneath everything, the setbacks, the deferred plans, the early mornings and the 4:15 train, and the intake folders sorted by date. Underneath the burn mark on the lapel, she always kept facing the wall. It had always been there. Here is what people like Elliot Hargrove never understand, and maybe never will. The people who are quiet in the back of the room are not always the people who have nothing to say. Sometimes they are the ones who have learned, through long practice, to wait until the moment their words cannot be ignored. They do not need to announce themselves. They do not need to be invited. They bring what they have, and they set it on the table, and they let the numbers speak. Priya Nair had known this since she was 17 years old, sitting in the back row of a public school classroom in Brooklyn, working problems that nobody else in the room could finish. She had always known it. It had just taken Hargrove and Aldrich 4 years to catch up. I keep thinking about that manila folder, $8.40 at a Staples 2 blocks from her apartment, and inside it was something that could save a company $4 million. Nobody asked her to print it. Nobody asked her to find it. Nobody asked her to find it. Nobody even knew she was looking. That's the part that stays with me. Priya didn't do what she did because someone opened a door for her. She did it because she had spent years building something that couldn't be taken away, a mind that kept working even when the circumstances said stop. That's not luck. That's not charm. That's a particular kind of integrity, the kind that shows up even when no one is watching, even when the reward isn't guaranteed, even when the most reasonable thing to do would be to delete the email and go back to the intake folders. I think about how easy it would have been for her to let it go. She had every reason to. She was level 2. She had a 6-year-old who needed the hall light on. She was running the numbers on a grocery bill, and the people who built that model had MBAs from schools she'd been priced out of by a hospital bill and a difficult year. There was no obvious upside. There was actually obvious risk. The risk of being laughed out of a room on the 32nd floor by people who had already decided what she was. She went anyway. That decision, to act on what you know is right even when it costs you something, even when the outcome is uncertain, that's what I'd call the foundation of a decent life. Not the promotion, not Elliot Hargrove finally seeing her. The decision she made alone at the kitchen table at midnight, with the hall light on and no one watching. And the thing about Priya is that she wasn't just brave, she was prepared. The analysis she brought into that room was 60 pages built from scratch, sourced, checked 3 times, written in plain language, because she understood that the point wasn't to impress anyone. The point was to be correct and to be clear. That's a different kind of intelligence than what gets tested in admissions offices. It's the kind that accumulates quietly over years through practice and attention and refusal to stop learning, even when life gives you 10 good reasons to. She never stopped sharpening, even when no one was grading it. And then there's the persistence. 11 nights at that table, after Benji was asleep, in the half-dark, running numbers that were nobody's responsibility but hers. Not 11 hours. 11 nights. That's not a burst of inspiration. That's something deeper. It's the long, unglamorous work of someone who has decided that what she knows matters, even if the world hasn't confirmed it yet. What happened to Priya happened because all 3 of those things were already in her before anyone promoted her. The ethics that made her act. The intellect that made her right. The persistence that made her ready. The room on the 32nd floor didn't create any of that. It just finally ran out of reasons to ignore it.